Hello and welcome to livealittlehigher.com. On this upcoming Monday night and Tuesday, we will be fasting in commemoration of Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av is the 9th of Av, and it's the day in which the spies came out of scouting the land of Israel when the Jews lived in the desert. And when they came out, they came with bad reports. And it was considered Lashon Hara because they came with evil talk, and they scared the Jewish people into entering the land. And the Jewish people started crying, and Hashem decreed that because they were crying for no reason, then we would have many reasons to cry on Tisha B'Av. So Tisha B'Av really is a Jewish mourning Memorial Day. It's a day in which many calamities afflicted the Jewish people throughout history. And not only our first and our second temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, but also we see that the expulsion of the English Jewry was also decreed in Tisha B'Av on July 18, 1290. The expulsion from Spain was also carried out on Tisha B'Av in 1492. The mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to Auschwitz death camps began on the 9th of Av of 1942. And many more. And these days are days that are not easy for the Jewish people. They're days in which we take extra precautions. We know that they're very serious days. So, but according to tradition, after the Mashiach comes and the third temple will be rebuilt, Tisha B'Av will be like another Jewish holiday, and instead of fasting, we will be feasting, God willing, soon in our days. And also, the 9th of Av is the day in which Mashiach is born. So in a positive note, Hashem doesn't send the disease before creating the cure. And to be able to understand what happened, because it's so hard for us to connect to the destruction of the two temples and to cry about them. Like imagine 9/11 happened not so long ago and we still have it so far away. Imagine two edifices that were destroyed thousands of years ago. How can we still have a connection to them, and how can we still cry for them? That's the question. If we never were there, we didn't experience them, we didn't feel them, how can we be crying for something that we never experienced? So to give you a little bit of Jewish history, the day that the first holy temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, it was a temple that was built by King Solomon. It was destroyed by the Babylonian Emperor Nebuchadnezzar, and it was destroyed in the year 423 before the Common Era. And it stood for more than 400 years since its building. And to understand what this place represented, it was really the house of God. And it was a time in which the Shekhinah of Hashem was very much felt. It was a place where open miracles happened all the time. And even the other nations used to come and offer their sacrifices in the holy temple. So it was like a window of light to the world. And the daily sacrifices were made there. And it was an entire Jewish rhythm of lifestyle that was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple, and the Jewish people went into exile. So the reason why this temple, the first temple, the King Solomon temple, was destroyed was because there were three cardinal sins that were going on in those days. One was paganism, which is idol worship. Then there was murder. People were murdered right and left. And there was adultery. So one brought the other. When the Jewish people started idol worshiping other gods, which were gods from other nations, and these gods were like human gods with human needs, the Jewish people started misbehaving and they started killing without regarding life, and they started having adulterous relationships. And this was like the top of the iceberg. And Hashem, instead of destroying the Jewish people, he destroyed the home. And 53 years after the Jews were forced out of Jerusalem, the Persian ruler Cyrus permitted them to return to their land. And this occurred in the year 371 before the Common Era. And then a few years later, the king Darius from Persia gave the Jews permission to build the second temple. So the second temple didn't have the glory of the first temple, but very much it was also a very special place, and the Shekhinah of Hashem was there, and the mitzvahs pertaining the holy temple were instituted again, and this temple stood for 420 years, and this was destroyed approximately in the year 70 from the Common Era. And the reason why the second temple was destroyed was because amongst the Jews there was a lot of strife, and there was a lot of baseless hatred. People hated each other. They didn't even understand why they didn't like each other, and there were many different groups of Jews. Like today, we have the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, all these secular liberals, whatever you want, and they didn't get along, and they really mistreated each other, because there's no problem in having different people with different ideas and different ways of looking at the world. The problem is when people don't respect each other, and they don't and they mistreat other people. This is what Hashem can't stand. And the strength of the Jewish people really is in their unity. When they're able to connect together and unite one to the other, despite the difference that each one feels one for the other, that when they see that we're one, that we're really one entity with Hashem, and we love each other despite our differences, then that's when Hashem really gives us power. He really takes good care of us. So there's a mashal, there's an analogy, a story that will explain a little bit of what is the destruction of the temples in an earthly story of a king, a very powerful king that had a son, and he wanted this son to be the next king. His name was Alexander. And but from an early age, this boy was a problem. He was a very rebellious son. He always misbehaved. He was always going on the father went to the right, he went to the left. And every time he grew more and more, his rebelliousness became even more complicated and not easy to handle. So the advisors of the king advised him to send that son away to a faraway land where he would live not in royalty. He would live in a place where he wouldn't have these comforts of the royal palace. And maybe in this place he would understand of what he missed, what he was missing, and he would come back to his ways, and in that way he could come back to the kingdom and be the next king if he appreciated what he had. The problem was that this boy, every time he became farther and farther, he went farther and farther away from his father, and he started hanging around with very bad people, and he started doing very bad things. And through the years, he got so disconnected from his father that he even forgot his father. He even forgot his name was Alexander. He started calling himself Al. And one day he was in the forest and he was attacked by a group of thugs. Hashem every time made his life harder and harder. The king, in that case, because the king is God, made his life harder and harder. He made that he lost money, that someone stole from him, that his house burned down. He would do all these schemes to see if the son would come back, but the son was completely aloof, and every time he would go even deeper and deeper into his sinful ways. And one day he was attacked by these thugs in the forest, but the kings, he had a group of people that used to follow him without him knowing, and that they should take care of him. When they saw these guys were hitting him and bullying him and almost killing him, they came to his rescue, and they saved him. And one of these men was an old man, and he came to him and he said, "You fool, here you are lying on the floor, poor, sick, hungry, beaten, and you could be sitting in a throne in a castle, and you would be dressed in regal clothing and you would be eating delicious food, and you're crazy." So the boy, the guy who is not a boy anymore, he's a young adult, and he looks at the old man. He says, "You're crazy. What are you talking about?" So he said, "If you have any brains, you would listen to me. I'm trying to help you," the old man said to him. Then the expression on his face changed from being stern to being curious. "And you really don't remember, do you?" And the guy looked at him and says, "Really? I don't remember anything." He says, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Al." And he says, "No," shouted the old man, "your name is not Al. Your name is Alexander. And you're the son of the king that lives in the capital." And he said, "You are from the capital. You grew up in the palace." And the prince says, "What are you talking about? I don't remember growing up in a palace. I don't remember that. What are you saying? You're crazy. Leave me alone." So the old man continues saying, "You're a prince. You're a prince. Your father rules over the country." So the prince stared at the man, not really knowing what to do. He thought he was completely crazy. But the man continued and he said, you're the prince. Your father, His Highness, he's a very kind king and a special father, but from the time you were able to talk, you became a problem. You're nothing but trouble. So your father didn't know what to do with you, and the advisors advised him to send you to a faraway land where you would be not so rich and not so comfortable, and maybe in that way you would be able to do teshuvah, you would be able to regret what you had done, and you would come back to your father. But that didn't happen. Every time you sinned more and more and more, and you fell lower and lower. But you know what? Your father loves you. He loves you very much. All these years he's been trying to get you back to him, and he does everything to make you realize that he's waiting for you. And so the boy looked at him and says, "How do you know all this?" He says, "Because I know. I was one of the advisors that told your father to let you go." So here, the prince now looked full of shame. He realized that he was the prince. He remembered, and he suddenly started crying, and he started saying, "Papi, papi, daddy, daddy, I want to come back home. I want to come back home." And the old man said, "I really do. Do you really believe now?" And the boy said, "Yes, I remember. And he started crying, "And I want to return home." And at that moment, the ground started moving, and suddenly a carriage came, and the king stepped out, and he embraced his son, and he says, "I have been waiting for you all these years. Come home." So this mashal, this story, what it's telling us is that Hashem is the king, and we're that rebellious son. We're in this world, and we want to be the ones that know better. We're rebellious. We don't want to do Hashem's will. We want to do what we want. We don't want to do what He tells us to do. And life is suffering. We have all this suffering. There's people that don't find to get married, people that can't have children, people that get sick. And we have all this suffering around us. And we see poor people in the streets, and we see so much suffering. But all that suffering is meant to be there so we can recognize our Father in heaven, so we can get close to Him. And He creates that, so He gives us the opportunity to be able to return to Him. But we're so stubborn that we don't want to see, and we forget who the king is and who we are. We really are the children of that king, and He's waiting for us. So the question is, how do we mourn? Do we mourn when we can't remember our temple, when we can't remember our Hashem, when we're so far away? How can we mourn? So the old man gave the prince advice, and he told him like this. He said, you should cry because of the grief of the Hurban, of the destruction of the temples. But if that doesn't help you, if you can't cry because you cannot connect to that reality, then we should cry because we can't cry. That should be the reason we cry, because we can't cry. Because the biggest reason to cry is because we forgot. And there's a story of a girl that is told by a teacher. This teacher, he was telling these orphan kids to make an image of their home, to remember how their home looked, how their room looked, how the parents were with them, how they smelled. And suddenly this little girl, she started crying, like sobbing. She couldn't stop. And the teacher said, what did you remember? What are you crying? She says, I'm crying because I can't remember anything. I don't remember my room. I don't remember my father. I don't remember my mother. And I'm crying because I don't know what I'm missing. So when we don't know what we're missing, we should be crying because we don't know what we're missing. And that's enough reason to be crying. And it says that the tears that we shed on Tisha B'Av really are tears of blessing, because whoever mourns for the destruction of the two temples will see the temple be rebuilt. We'll have that zehut, we'll have that merit. And there's another story here of when the Western Wall became ours again in 1967. The soldiers came to recapture it, and there were two soldiers. All the soldiers were crying, but there were two soldiers that couldn't cry. They couldn't cry. They were looking at each other and they couldn't cry. Like they had no connection to the wall, had no connection to Jewish history. They had no connection to their roots. They couldn't cry. And suddenly, one of the soldiers began sobbing and crying, and he couldn't stop crying. And the friend looked at him like he's crazy, like, why are you crying? Why are you crying? And he says, I am crying because I have no feeling to cry. Because I'm crying because I can't cry. And that's the worst thing. To be able to cry is a gift. When people have a feeling, when you can feel, and you can feel it inside of you and cry, it is a gift. When we are so far away that we can't feel, that's enough of a reason to cry. And to give you Hisuk, to give you strength in these days and in our life, we should see ourselves as special people. Am Israel Hai, the Jewish people live. And the beauty is when we see what happened to us after these destructions. The Jewish people were exiled throughout the world, and everywhere you go, you'll find synagogues, you'll find Jewish schools, you'll find Jewish homes, you'll find Jewish life. And this is the biggest miracle of all, that despite that we don't have temples, that we don't have the Shekhinah shining on top of us, that we don't have God looking at us, or He is looking at us, but we feel He's not, all day we still continue learning, we still continue growing, we still continue living as Jewish people. And this is the biggest source of nahes, of satisfaction that God can have. To see a Jew in 2017 walking in the streets with a kippah in his head, to see Jewish children being taught in Jewish schools, to see Jewish homes, to see Jewish weddings. This is the biggest satisfaction. And this is what's going to bring Mashiach back. And on top of it, we have to really love each other and work on being loving and caring and really respecting one towards the other. And in that way, we will see our third temple being rebuilt, and we will have the opportunity to live in a world where there's no more pain and no more suffering, and we're all close to our Father in heaven. So I wish you a good fast, and we should see joy. We should change these fast days to joyful days, to feasting days with Mashiach. Thank you, and live a little higher.